Finally, we come to Ketu in earth signs and Rahu in a water sign. So these people on the surface often appear to be doing the best, but that's on the surface, that's on the exterior. Growing up, material things, practical thinking is emphasized, responsibility is emphasized, a good day's work is emphasized, and their parents will emphasize doing the right thing, doing what's supposed to be done, taking care of material needs, but not so much emphasizing emotional needs. So these people grow up in a world where material needs are emphasized. They'll get 3 meals a day, but they won't get 3 hugs a day. They'll get 3 meals a day and 1 hug every 10 years maybe. So the concrete things that they need to survive are there and provided and emphasized. And mom and dad feel like as long as I'm taking care and providing for my kids, I am being a good parent. That's their idea of a good parent usually. And so the kid grows up in an environment where material things and practical things become the important things. If the kid breaks something of one of their parents or breaks something in the house, they're usually going to be in trouble for the fact that they broke a valuable material object. All right? And it won't be like you broke a valuable material object, but I love you anyway. It's like you're bad for breaking a material object. So through examples, through experiences, they start emphasizing that as long as things are taken care of materially, everything's going to be okay. I won't get in trouble if I don't screw up materially, if I don't break something, if I fulfill my responsibilities, if I do a good job with my work. As long as I do the material things, manage those well, I'll maintain as much peace and harmony growing up as I can. That's the Ketu in the earth sign person. But the emotional aspects of life are not emphasized. So, Ketu and earth rashis hold ideas that give importance to material needs and the care of material objects. Their security is dependent upon the concrete reality as told to them by their senses. As long as everything's okay with the material things, everyone's doing a good job and everyone's going to be accepted and everything's going to be cool. That's the Ketu in an earth sign. And lots of it is too, as long as they have money, because earth signs are about money, having the means to do things. I have Ketu in an earth sign. I remember as a kid, I started making money pretty early, but I remember when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, I was traveling a lot, and when I was fortunate enough to be able to keep $1,000 in my wallet, I felt like, okay, I got enough money to get through whatever might be thrown at me. But this fact that I had $1,000 in my wallet gave me a sense of security, that life was going to be okay no matter what got thrown at me. So Ketu and earth signs, when materially things are stable, they feel like, okay, things are going to work out, But then fortunately I got thrown to an early age into a lot of financial disasters, and I had no money in my wallet for many, many years and had to, embrace the more surrendering aspects of Rahu and Pisces, which was really great. But I remember that time where I could open my wallet and see $1,000 in it as a kid wandering around, traveling around, doing my things that I was doing. I felt like, okay, I'm going to be able to get to the next step of my life. It was just that security. But then ultimately that security was lost. And I had to, do more magic tricks to feel secure, okay? So that's another story for another time. If the concrete reality is that of what is thought as right, then they believe that everything in life will be okay. So if concretely things are the way they think they should be are right and taken care of, they feel like everything will be okay in life. Okay. This results from an early environment where all was well when material concerns were taken care, and that was the focus, leaving feelings largely ignored. It is very threatening to look at their emotional needs, and it is very threatening to connect to life around them through their feelings, as to do so in their early life left little happy room for a connection in an environment where there was insufficient emotional connection. So, emotional connection, what does it do? The water signs are basically the spiritual signs, right? They're the Brahmins too. So these spiritual signs, it's about connection. Connection is something to fall back on. when everything else fails, having something to fall back on that makes you feel good. That's what the emotional connection's for. You know? So say, you know, your car breaks down, you're cold and wet and starving, but you know at home you got a person who loves you and you love them. Then you fall back on that connection. People who go to war, they're holding on to this emotional connection of a woman that they love, or their wife, or their children. And while they're fighting the war, all the hardships that they suffer there, that they can't change. The material circumstances suck with what they're doing. But they can fall back onto the comfort of that emotional connection, and it serves them well. But with people who have Ketu in an earth sign, they don't have that emotional connection to fall on. They didn't develop it. They didn't recognize the importance of it. They weren't taught that. So ultimately, they need to learn to develop an emotional, spiritual connection to fall back on when materially everything fails. And, you know, for me, back in the days when I was like 21, I went through a period where everything went wrong. I invested all my money into something, worked really hard for 6 months, and then through a fluke of chance, this importer I was working with decided not to do business with these wealthy people that I'd been working with for 6 months. And they spoke Japanese, I didn't, and all of a sudden, all my investment of the last 6 months was wasted. And I spent all my savings, like, you know, a few $1,000s, and it was all over. And I had no money for food. I really couldn't even pay rent. And I had to like turn towards divine principles of prosperity to emotionally or spiritually attract the money I needed to pay my rent. And I actually managed to do it. Luckily, and I didn't get evicted, and things eventually turned around. But it was all because of embracing Rahu for a little bit, going to the water sign. So when we realize there's something we can fall back onto, spiritually or emotionally, that's the Rahu in the water signs. Now, people who got Ketu in water signs, though, they're always falling back on that 24/7. They think that's all that matters, and so they don't do enough material work. People with Ketu in earth signs, though, they're always doing the material work, always being responsible, always taking care of things, always being concerned with their finances, taking care of people, too, because people can be responsibilities. But they're not spending enough time regularly falling back, developing what they can fall back on, developing an emotional connection that they can fall back on, so that the thought of the person gives them strength, for instance. So they can be fighting a war or getting beat up financially or be ill or whatever. And the thought of a person gives them strength and helps them survive. Or the thought of God or the divine gives them strength and helps them to survive. That's what they need to develop. An emotional connection is something to fall back on. And I use that word fall back on because we're here in the material world. Most of life is material. Okay? We can't be foolish bliss bunnies here. We have material stuff that has to be done. We have material karmas to burn, right? So we live in a material world, but we need that water sign to fall back on. That's what gives us the comfort to get through the material world that we live in. So if a person doesn't develop that because they have Ketu in in an earth sign, and they're emphasizing doing the material thing all the time instead of connecting to the emotional thing, then a point comes where emotionally they're so unhappy because we are spiritual beings, right? The ultimate goal of all of us is to evolve to the state of being a Brahman, which is being connected to God. Yogananda said we cannot be enlightened until we've experienced divine friendship, which means having a true human connection. And that he doesn't mean a romantic connection or a sexual connection. He means a true, compassionate connection to somebody, of true care, of true friendship, which he considered the highest friendship. Like, a good example from movies would be Sam Gamgee and Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. So Sam had this quality of divine friendship towards Frodo. Frodo couldn't really return it because he was plagued by the burden of the ring. But Sam had this absolute divine friendship. So the next person to be enlightened in The Lord of the Rings will most certainly be Sam. And So this capacity to connect to something with full caring, with full compassion, we need to develop that if we're going to connect to the divine. Because connecting to the divine is a great extension of that, ultimately. A greater expression of that. And people with Ketu and Earth signs don't spend enough time developing those emotional connections because they don't realize the importance of those, and they don't realize the importance of those because they weren't indicated as important in their early environment. Which also means in their past life. So in this lifetime, they build the material lives, they fulfill their responsibilities. On the surface, they look like they have their lives together. But underneath, they're not making that connection that all humans need. All humans need the water signs more than any other. That's where we're all going ultimately. Ultimately, we're all going to become Brahmins, become connected to the divine. We're all going towards a greater and greater emotional connection. So ironically, ultimately, the only thing that matters is the emotional connection. But that doesn't mean we can have an emotional connection and shirk all our responsibilities and watch everyone we love die around us, or be starved, or be picked on because they're wearing funny clothing to school. Right? So it's a tricky balance between these water and earth signs. It's a balance between living on earth and developing a spiritual capacity, which starts as the capacity to connect to people. And it gets expanded into the capacity to connect to the divine. So Yogananda was extremely connected to his mother. When his mom died, he transferred that connection to the divine. He had Ketu and a water sign, so he was an emotionally connected person. So he transferred it to the divine. But a person who's got Ketu and an earth sign, they're not developing, they don't experience growing up such a deep emotional connection. Instead, they develop material connections. I'm your father, and I do this for you. Not I'm your father, and therefore I love you and cherish you and adore you. That's Ketu in water signs. Okay? So everything's measured practically, materially, for what it is in the concrete form. Okay? So as a father, I take care of this responsibility. How I feel about it is irrelevant. That's Ketu in an earth sign. Okay? Ketu in a water sign is, as a father, I love you. What I do for you is irrelevant. Okay? So it's sort of funny, these two very different extremes. So ultimately, these people, the Ketu and the earth sign will fail them because while they might have everything working in their lives because practically they've paid attention to their material concerns and they've made good, sensible choices perhaps, emotionally they can be very, very empty. And, you know, water and earth, they're the two most important elements in a way. As far as us finding fulfillment. Water is what's fulfilling, but earth is what holds the water. So you have a cup made of clay, which is the earth, and the water's in there so you can drink it. You just have water, but you can't get it, you know, you don't have a vessel to get it into you. What good does it do you? If you just have earth, if you just have a bunch of clay jugs, and it's empty, and there's no water in it, what good does it do you to have all that earth? It doesn't do any good. And so ultimately, what the person needs, which again is water, at the end we're all searching for water. We all want to become greater Brahmins, more connected to the divine, more connected to life, which starts with being connected to the people we're attracted to. Without that, all the material things are empty. They're all empty jugs, no matter how beautiful the jug. If it's made out of gold, if it's has diamonds embedded on it, if there's no water in it, it's a worthless jug. It's a worthless cup, okay? So, ultimately, their material lives and being materially responsible doesn't make life work out the way they want to, and they end up being very, very miserable. And then they have to start finding things they can be connected to emotionally. Okay? They have to find things, a person, people, an ideal, a religion, a guru, a religion, something that they can fall back on emotionally, that's something that emotionally they're connected to, that fulfills them, that gives them extra strength to get through this life. Okay? And once they realize, well, once K2 fails them, and they realize they need something else besides just making their material lives work. And see, the funny thing is, like I mentioned, we're always touching on Rahu our whole life. You always want to jump into Rahu a little bit. So everyone is trying to work towards their Rahu, but they never get it because they're too focused on doing the K2 thing. So the Rahu in a fire sign person really wants to connect socially and really wants to share socially. But they're not doing the things that make that work. Instead, they're just being fire, which burns too hot to connect to. K2 in water signs want to do something that's lasting. They want something that's solid and secure. I'm sorry, K2 in a water sign wants that. They want the Rahu in the earth sign. But they live their lives as a water sign, and so they never get the earth, and so on. So, K2 in an air sign, as social as they are, they really want to be themselves. They really want to be somebody. But because they're playing everything social, they're losing sight of who they are. Okay? And finally, K2 in earth signs wants to connect to things emotionally. But, in fact, some people I know with Rahu in water signs are the biggest, they'll talk about love and relationships and connecting more than any other position. Because wherever Rahu is, we're always thinking and fantasizing and dreaming about. So when these people open up and feel comfortable, they immediately start talking about connections. Relationship connections, spiritual connections, whatever. But then they're living their lives as an earth sign based on all practicalities. And so they don't get the emotional fulfillment. And that's always the ironic thing, is part of us always wants the Rahu sign and believes we're going to get it. But how are we going to get it? Well, K2 makes us think there's only one way anything's going to work, and that is by playing by my K2 rules, which is K2 in whatever sign it's in. By playing by those rules, I'll get my Rahu fantasy worked out, is what they think. But it doesn't work that way. By playing according to Rahu's rules, Rahu's fantasies will work out. By playing K2's rules, only half their lives will work out. And that's what always happens. We stick to K2, so half our dreams come true, all by themselves. It hardly felt like we did them. And all the things we were hoping to be realized, all the dreams we thought we were hoping to be realized, don't get realized because we have been playing in accordance with Rahu's rules. So the K2 and earth sign person has, by paying attention to practicals and being responsible, has not been doing what a water sign needs to do, which is to be impractical, to be foolish, to do something that's crazy. Like I said, K2 and water sign people will look crazy more than any other sign. Everyone thought Yogananda was crazy. His dad, who was a devotee and did Kriya Yoga every day and meditated for hours, thought Yogananda was crazy, wanting to go to the Himalayas and wanting to be a yogi full time. So, having this, so the Rahu and a water sign person needs to learn that for Rahu things to work out, they have to dive into them emotionally. They have to do crazy things. And that's when they'll have the fulfillment they need. When they do something because it's emotionally charged, not because it makes sense. Earth signs do practical things. And as we do practical things work out. The thing is, emotional things are not based on practicalities. So people don't become enlightened, don't connect to God because they're practical, right? People connect to God because they're impractical. Like St. Francis, and says, how are we going to find God. And he opens up the Bible and puts his finger down blindfolded. And one of the things he gets is, sell all that you have and give the money to the poor. It's like, wow, that's not practical, right? But it takes that level of insanity to connect to the divine, to get that divine miracle to connect to. When I was broke and I couldn't pay rent, my rent was due the next day. And even though I'd always been practical, through a twist of fate, all of a sudden I had nothing. And my rent was due the next day, and I didn't have enough money to pay the rent. And a friend had recommended a book on prosperity to me and tithing, and said to give 10% to the church. So I figured out how much money I made the last month, and it wasn't enough to pay rent. And I was short of rent by a lot of money, but I wrote out a check for the 10% of what I'd made. And I sent that off in the mail to some church, to some religious association. And then after that, since I had no work and no money and nothing to do, I decided to go on a bike ride, which I did pretty much every day. I jumped on my bike and I rode down my street to where I could go left to the beach or right. And that day was a hot day, so I thought, I'm going to go left to the beach, ride 10 miles up the coast, take a swim, and ride back. That was one of my routines. But right when I got to that corner, this cold blast of air came up. I'm like, wow, that's actually cold out. I think I'll go right, which took me to the hills where I would ride through the mountains on the dirt roads. So I went mountain biking instead. And at the gate to the park where we mountain bike, there was a guy who saw a part on my bike, and he's like, what is that part? And I'm like, oh, this is like one of only a few of these out. They just came out. I was selling these to these Japanese guys, but now they're gone, and I had this extra, so I just threw it on my bike. He's like, oh, that would work perfect on my bike. Can I buy it from you? And I'm like, sure. And so I sold it to him, and he paid me $50 more than I needed to pay my rent. So I paid my rent, had $50 for food. And it all happened in 24 hours. Rent was due, I wrote the check, the wind changed and pushed me to the mountains, and I met the guy who had the money. Just like that. And so after that, I thought, oh, that's a great idea. So then I started riding my bike out on the trails, handing people these little notes that I could get them bike parts for cheap, because I had lots of connections. And that's how I started getting my prosperity back, was selling bike parts out on the trails for about 2 months to get me through that really tough phase of life. And so, all because of doing something foolish. I didn't have enough money for rent, so what do? I give some money to the church. That's stupid. If somebody comes to you and says, yeah, I don't have money for rent, so I'm going to give half my money away, they're going to go, that's stupid. If you give half your money away, the chances of you paying your rent is even less. That's stupid. Don't do that. But materially, I had failed. There was no way in hell I was going to pay my rent I could think of in the next day, tomorrow. Okay? So we have to ultimately, when Rahu's in a water sign, we have to do something stupid to connect. Emotional connections, a connection to the divine, a connection to prosperity, to something greater than the practical, through a force that you can fall back on, requires a bit of foolishness. And that's why if you read the stories of people who've been spiritually successful, they have always done something foolish for the sake of their spiritual lives. Okay? And they've been called foolish by other people. All right. So Rahu in water signs needs to develop that foolishness of connecting to something emotionally, even though it doesn't make sense. You see, God demands that of us. God literally demands that of us to say, oh, you want me? Well, you're going to have to prove it by doing something foolish. And literally, he asks us to prove that we want him by being fools somehow. And even in love, people feel loved when you prove it through some foolish endeavor. For instance, buying a diamond necklace for $20,000, or even buying a diamond ring for 2 months of your salary. I mean, really, is that little diamond really worth 2 months of your salary, which is what they recommend to buy as your engagement ring? No, it's not. You and your partner could spend that money, 2 months of your salary, and just go on vacation for 2 months. Or just buy something useful. It's not sensible to spend 2 months' income on a diamond ring. But because it's not sensible is why it makes somebody feel loved. All right, so making emotional connections requires an element of foolishness. Making emotional connections to the divine, making emotional connections to people requires an element of foolishness. But Ketu and Taurus people, Ketu and Earth sign people have a hard time being foolish and just living on an emotional impulse, following an emotional need. Because the idea is, as long as I do everything sensibly and practically and focus on the material life working out, everything will be okay. But it won't be. Only the material will be okay, and the other half of their lives will be empty. And that's an important area of life. All areas of life are important. So a good concrete reality does not necessarily provide the fulfillment of emotional needs. And so the person must explore their need to connect with their feelings and discover their lacking emotional needs through Rahu's position. And so ultimately, that's what they'll have to experience more. And always in every Rahu Ketu position, the balance that needs to be achieved. It's never about going one way all the way or the other way. It's about embracing more of Rahu to do a better job with Ketu. So, the Ketu, say in the water sign person, wants more, needs true emotional fulfillment. The problem they're having is they emotionally connect to things that don't work materially. When they cease to work materially, it hurts emotionally. Right? And so emotionally they end up being screwed. So they learn to connect to things. If they learn to allow for things to be practical and work, then they can count on those things emotionally, and then they can cling to those emotionally, and they'll be worthy to cling to. See, clinging to something that practically doesn't work will hurt you in the end. That's what Ketu in a water sign needs to find out. Okay? Ketu and earth signs need to learn that if I'm being responsible and taking care of things and being practical about things that don't make me feel fulfilled, is it really intelligent to do so? It's not, right? We should not get our fingers dirty with anything that's not emotionally fulfilling somehow. But Ketu and earth signs do it all the time. Okay? But that doesn't make sense, right? That's idiotic behavior. Rahu and Ketu always do that. So Ketu in an earth sign needs to find something they can connect to emotionally and then be practical with it. And then they have a practical life that's fulfilling instead of a practical life that's unfulfilling. All right? Ketu in like a fire sign is all about being themselves. But being themselves all alone sucks. It gets boring and they start fading. Fire needs something to burn. It needs some movement to burn. It needs the air. So eventually they can't be their best selves. But by finding social interactions that fuel their fire, they can be a better version of their self. All right? Then Ketu in air signs, they want to connect. They want to share. They want to interchange, right? Not connect so much. They want to interchange. Water wants to connect and cling, but air wants to interchange. And air and water are the more social signs. They both have a social aspect. So the air signs want to interchange. Interchange what? By going to the fire signs and finding something more valuable in themselves, they have more to interchange, and then their interchanges are more desirable. Because in the end, we want more of Ketu. Rahu is just the road we take to get more of Ketu. And then we have Ketu refined at a higher level. And Ketu is the 9th planet. It's the final thing. It's the end of the road. It's the liberation, ultimately. It's the freedom from the past constrictions, the past restraints. So ultimately, we have to go back to Ketu. But we can't go back to it in a useful way until we've embraced Rahu. So every sign needs to do that. Go to Rahu, pick up what it needs to make Ketu really work this time.